better questions, talking about asking yourself, right? Like getting that kind of check in place, is that better questions lead to better answers. Better answers lead to a better life. And he talks about, and I think this ties into what you just said, Eric, is how you humble yourself when you challenge yourself to be better.
Hello and welcome to the Dream Architect Life with Brian Sweet and Brittany Anderson from Sweet Financial Partners. If you're just joining us, this is part 3 of a 3-part series. Brian and Brittany are covering an amazing book that's very much in line with, number one, this podcast and the book that they wrote. Brittany, how are you?
I am just so darn good.
Brian tells me that all the time, that you're fantastic, you're good, you're great.
She's always smiling, always happy. What do you say?
Yeah, I wish I had somebody in my office like that. It's just me. I look in the mirror, not smiling, not happy. Anyway, I got to improve.
Well, just
on that.
call us, Eric. We'll help.
We'll spice you up.
There we go. Yeah, perfect. All right, like I told the audience, this is part 3. Can you just give them just a brief recap of what the first 2 were about so they know?
Yeah, so we have basically been diving into our favorite chapters from Ed Milet's recent book, The Power of One More. To give context, if you didn't catch the last 2 episodes, which I highly encourage you to do, but basically what we're doing is looking at some of the similarities between what he teaches on and what we've been talking about here on the Dream Architect Life. What we wrote about in our book, Dream Architecture, I shared in the first of this 3-part series that Brian and I kind of sat there and went, oh my goodness, there are so many similarities. There are so many synergies between our piece of work and his piece of work that we want to highlight what he put out into the world and bring it to the relevance of our audience. So week 1, or episode 1, I should say, we talked about One More Identity and how it's so important that if you're coming from something, from some level of success and going to something else, to not limit yourself, to really make sure that you allow yourself to lean into who you're meant to be versus who you've been up to this point. The second episode on this series, we talked about the power of one more dream and why it's important to embrace the imagination that we had when we were kids, a little bit of the science behind it, and how that can potentially help you as you navigate your future and as you navigate that what's next and lean into the possibility of the big dreams and the big vision that you have for your future. So today's topic is a really interesting one, and we chose this because it's just something that isn't talked about enough and that I think is so different, not only for our industry, but for every human being as a whole. And it's the power of one more question to ask ourselves. So along these lines, Dan Sullivan, who we talk about obsessively, but I'm going to reference him again because I have to. So Dan Sullivan, creator of The Strategic Coach, he has this tool that's thinking about your thinking. And I remember the first workshop that I went to and had this tool slipped in front of me. I was like, this is so weird. Like, what does this mean? Thinking about my thinking. I'm thinking right now. So now I have to think about what I'm thinking about and then write it down. I don't know. But there's so much power behind it because people don't take enough time to sit and actually think about what is running through their minds and what maybe serves them and what doesn't. So I'll pause there before I go any further. I don't know, Brian, if you have anything you want to add at that point.
No, but you've got me intrigued.
Me too.
All right, we're going to rock and roll with this then. So, people often don't take control of their thoughts, and they have what Ed talks about as being a flawed belief behind what they think to be true. So of course I go to this first example. My brain immediately draws this way, that let's just say, you have a significant other and they do something that ticks you off and you're like, oh, I mean, not to say that anybody here ever does anything like that with their spouses, but so let's just say they do something that just makes you mad and that you're like, oh, they, didn't put their dishes on the counter or whatever. And then all of a sudden it's like, you know what? They actually never clean up. And you know what? I'm the one who's been doing this for all along. And actually, I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. I don't even know if I like them. And your brain just goes down this rabbit hole when in reality, they probably just forgot to bring a cup and put it in the sink. But the problem is that we don't catch ourselves in this negative spiral. So I use that example because we can all relate to, having maybe a little bit of a disagreement with our spouses. It happens. You're around each other all the time. So I use that a little facetiously. But the true issue, or the underlying thing that I think people could really start focusing attention on, is that just because in a moment we believe something to be true, it doesn't actually mean that it is. And I think some of the people who have really opened themselves up to the greatest possibility have the ability to pause in a moment and think, is this path that my brain is going down, is this going to serve me in my future? Is this the reality, or am I just mad? It can be on the opposite end of the spectrum. Am I just really excited? Am I just really energized, where all of a sudden I may be falling in love with my own new idea, new concept, new business, new whatever, without really doing the work to test what's reality and what's going to hit and what's not. So this can be applied in so many different ways that it's just that little bit of momentum to stop and say, am I really thinking about this the right way? It's pausing to think about what you're thinking about, which I know can be a little bit of a heavy topic, but I think it's an interesting one.
I think there's a point where you have to step back and whatever the scenario is, you have to give yourself and others grace to be able to think and navigate yourself back to more of a reality. Dreaming is great, but when you don't have the reality to go with it, and that those either the checks and balances, or like you said, the testing, it can run away with you, and it can really, you can go in a direction you don't want to be in very, very quickly.
Yeah, and there's a part in the book where Ed talks about how better questions, talking about asking yourself, right? Like getting that kind of check in place, is that better questions lead to better answers. Better answers lead to a better life. And he talks about, and I think this ties into what you just said, Eric, is how you humble yourself when you challenge yourself to be better. So if something that I've been thinking about has been holding me back, it's been a limited belief, it's that whole notion of deserving. We talked about that on one of our recent episodes about how you have to believe that you deserve the success that you desire, because if you don't have that belief and you're not constantly striving for that, then it's a lot harder to reach what you want. So that's why personally, I don't believe in the whole adage or notion of you can't teach an old dog new tricks. It's like, no, the dog just doesn't want to learn. So you can, if you put in the time, energy, resources, you get the right who's around the dog, the professionals, the experts who've seen it done before, who know what it takes to get there. I mean, we're really no different than just a bunch of old dogs, right? We have to choose, are we going to allow the teachers around us to put us in spaces that are maybe a little uncomfortable, but to really stretch? I think about recently, I was on a call with a gentleman, and he has like an immersive couple-day experience, and he was like, hey, I'm going to invite you to attend, and it's going to be probably outside your box, and it's going to push you. And I'm sitting there like literally terrified, because this guy is like the most blunt human being I think I've ever met in my life. I am terrified to go. Like, I'm so scared, but I'm so stinking excited at the same time, because I know that it's pushing myself outside of my box. And I will tell you that after I said yes, after I was like, okay, I'm going to do this, I thought of like 50 million reasons why I should pull back, why I shouldn't go, why I should be like rescind on it. And they're all legitimate excuses in my brain. But after I did that notion of thinking about what I'm thinking about, I'm like, Brittany, you're just getting in your own way. You're scared and you're trying to back out. That's all that this is. So, best case scenario, you go and you meet some cool people and you learn some new things and you take the businesses to the next level. Worst case scenario, you go, you meet some cool people and nothing changes. So it's just putting yourself in the position to give a reality check and to really think about, are my thoughts serving me? Are they serving me and who I want to be, going back to that identity? Are they moving me closer to the dreams that I have for my future? And then am I just trying to sabotage myself because of those limiting beliefs? If you can say yes, then you probably need to move forward into that action, that challenge, that whatever is put in front of you, because it's what can get you to the next level.
Yeah. And I love that, Brittany. It's one of the things that we work on all the time is pushing the envelope, if you will, and you're probably the best example I know of people just stepping into whatever is uncomfortable and trying to make it comfortable, and that's why you've excelled like you've excelled. But the one thing about Ed's book is it's referencing one more of whatever put it down there, but this one more question to ask ourselves is a unique way of framing this. And it really is just, like how we would say it in our book, is just being conscious of what you put in your mind and what you put out into the public. And so by being conscious and looking for the right answers, and he calls it, one more question, but it's just being conscious of those things that you really need to do or want to do to get to some destination that you're not at yet. And in Brittany's case, scared to death, and she's been scared to death a lot. And, it's been remarkable to see her grow because of that. And this is just one example. So now she's gotten to the point where, she says yes, comes up with all the reasons why she shouldn't, but just doesn't listen to any of them.
Yeah. And as a concrete thinker, that's hard for me, right? I mean, and I think there's a lot of us out there that I'd love to hear some examples, right, of how this works, because it's not easy to retrain ourselves, especially when we're an old dog. Thank you, Brittany. So give me some examples. How do we actually get this accomplished?
Yeah, so Ed actually lays out in his book, I don't even remember how many questions there were, but there was a plethora of questions to start asking yourself. And, I think the thing that's interesting about this is that you do have to be trained. I mean, I even think about Brian's been in strategic coach, so has seen this whole thinking about your thinking concept for over 20 years now.
23.
Yeah. And for me, like I consider myself to be, a very optimistic person, a future-oriented person. Sometimes I'm so future-oriented, I annoy myself and others. Or I'm constantly thinking about what's next and, planning and all those things going forward. But what this forces you to do, we talked a little bit in the last episode, Eric, you gave the reference of the Wawa, you say it because you're going to say it better. I'm going to botch it.
We are with who we are with.
We are with who we are with. So if you really want to break this down to simplistic terms, it forces you to be so in the moment because you're being intentional with your thoughts. So I used this spouse idea or notion because it's an easy concept to relate to. It's one that we can all think about arguments. We can all think about the spiral. I mean, I think about it too. Like if there's a rough day in the office, I mean, I did a talk one time about having a rough day and it led to a rough evening and I was a hot mess by the end of the night and my kid puked in my hair and I had to go to work the next day. And it's like, we all think about those moments that spiral. And I could have very easily been like, none of this is worth it. Life is so stressful. I need to simplify. But instead, I just took pause. And I said, well, Brittany, is this a tough day, a tough moment, or is it a tough life? And I said, okay, well, it's a tough moment in time. So let's reel it in a little bit. Let's put it in check. So I think that just thought process about being present is so important. But we actually pulled out so that people can start thinking about, well, these questions, like what are these questions? What does it mean to ask yourself one more question? We pulled out a handful of them. So we chose the ones that we thought would resonate most with the audience. One being, what one more thing can I do to show my spouse or partner that I love them? So I had to do that because if I'm giving the example of my husband being a pain and not bringing his dishes to the counter, I got to figure out a way to give him some love too. So what's one more thing that you can do to show that love? Is there one more thing that I can do to show appreciation to the people I work with? So think about your teams. Like it's so darn easy to forget about those moments where people do really good things because you're used to them doing good things. I mean, I think about that for our team. They do a lot of great stuff and they do a lot of things right that it's kind of become the norm. So it forces us, or we have to force ourselves to be like, okay, today, how can I call somebody out for the good that they do? Because it's really easy to catch people doing things not right way. We'll just put it nicely, because it sticks out. You're not used to it. It catches you off guard. It stops you dead in your tracks. Asking yourself one more question is about being intentional with what you're thinking about and what you're putting out into the world. Another question too is, how is this happening for me and not to me? So I think that's a big one. And I know Brian gave the example in the last episode about, growing up with a single mom and his dad not being present. And he could have easily gone down a path that could have been, let's just say, nothing short of not self-serving and could have potentially been really negative, but instead looked at the blessings in his life and the people. And I had the great pleasure of meeting his Aunt Jean and seeing her dedication to lifelong learning and optimism and constantly finding the good. And I know I've given this example before, but I'll never forget how she was taking like painting classes at 90 years old. And she's like, well, I'm no good at it, but I figured I'd give it a shot. It's like, well, heck yeah.
Had to love it. Had to love it.
Yeah. So it's, it's those things that, how can life happen for you and not to you? What part of this situation can I control right now? That's a big one. When we start thinking about and obsessing over things that we can't control directly, oofda, that's a spiraling pit of heck, to say it nicely. When we start thinking about things, that's one thing that if you think about, let's just bring it to relevant to our clients, to our industry in the wealth planning world. If people are focusing on whatever the news is putting in front of them, if they're focusing on, depression and recession and all of these fear-based things and, monkeypox and COVID-19 and the political divide and gas prices and everything that you should just be so angry about. Here's all these horrible things that you should be focusing on. It's fear-mongering. And so when we have clients coming in and talking about some of those things, it's like, you know what? Those are real things that are being put out there, but can you control a single one of them directly? Always no. The answer is always no. So it's helping people shift to the things that are important. That's why we talk about dreaming big. And I know, Brian, I'm sure you could think of a million different scenarios where, you help people shift back to, okay, yeah, maybe the markets are a little bit tumultuous right now. Or, maybe there is a pending recession. We don't know. We don't know the answers to all of this. If we could predict it, we would be on a yacht somewhere probably, but we can't. So, it's helping people go back to, well, what did you say was meaningful to you? What are some of your goals? What are some of the things that are important? So if you're able to, as an individual, give yourself kind of the gut check and ask yourself that question before you start getting fearful, before you start spiraling, before you start letting the negative thoughts kind of, cloud your judgment, that's what's impactful, that's what's meaningful, and that's what helps you live potentially a more centered life because you're not letting that stuff control you. So those are a handful of examples. And there's a couple more too that we threw in. Like, what's one more way that I can become healthier? Health and wealth are very much related these days, which we will talk about more and more as we go forward. And then I love this one. Is there one more thing I can do to carve out time to be mindful and intentional? I think that one's powerful.
Yeah. My favorite on those was what's one more way I can practice gratitude? Because I think the more you write down reasons you're grateful, it just creates a different framework in your mind and helps you set the right standards going forward. Because, maybe it's going to be a tough day and it's hard to come up with something, but there's always something. Your pillow was soft, the water was cold that I got to drink, whatever you have to do. But some days there's more, places to write than you've actually got space. But the more you think those thoughts, the more good things happen to you.
Yeah, and Brian, I love the way you phrased it. What's one more thing how I can practice gratitude? Because again, I go back to the statement you made before. It's like exercise. It's a muscle you have to exercise. You have to practice. It's not easy because, as Brittany alluded to, our time is so limited and it's chaotic and we're putting out fires here or there. The things that draw our attention are the things that usually need to be fixed. And so if we're not intentional about taking that moment and pausing and saying, okay, I'm going to take this moment to practice gratitude and block everything else out, or I'm going to take this moment and practice how I can love my spouse better and block everything else out, it's just going to get lost in the shuffle, and all of a sudden 2 or 3 weeks go by and you haven't done any of it.
Yeah, and it's just part of creating like a daily routine, and these things are just what I would say are very important things to make sure you don't forget, because once consistently delivered, the results, once we've talked about, are pretty amazing. But you do have to take action. You do have to do a few things, but creating a habit of, daily in the morning, taking 15 minutes and doing a few things, it really doesn't probably take a lot more time than that. Before you get busy, just get up 15 or 30 minutes earlier in the day. Pretty soon you'll get used to that, and it's a real normal thing. Then you got everything done, you're on the same schedule, and the rest of the day is yours, but you've focused and created the emphasis to make it an amazing day, week, month, and then even better future.
Yeah, absolutely. Brittany, do you have any closing thoughts for today's podcast?
Yeah, I'm pulling this right from the book because I think it summarizes all the things that we've talked about to this point, and it's that, the best answers are going to be the most difficult to address when it comes to your own personal growth. And again, we're not a personal development, personal growth podcast. That's not what this is. I mean, we're trying to share insight and help people think in a positive way. But sometimes you got to answer the most difficult questions to really break through those barriers for your future. So if you find yourself sitting on a question that you don't love the answer to, or you're struggling to answer or struggling to take action on, that's probably the one you need to spend the most time on. So let yourself be challenged, let yourself dive into it. I highly recommend, we have no affiliation with Ed Milet. I'd love to meet him someday, but we have no affiliation with him. But grabbing his book, I think he's got some brilliance in there. We also, for those that don't know, when Brian talks about gratitude, we created a journal years ago. It's called Imagine, Act, Inspire by Brittany Anderson and Brian Sweet. You can get it on Amazon. To actually have that place to write down those thoughts of gratitude and to write down the things that are meaningful to you for that day. Each day starts out with a positive quote, and it's a way to set intention for your future, or for your day, for your mindset, and for your future going forward. So I think those are a couple things that people could do as takeaways today.
I love that. Guys, thank you so much for the content and the time today.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, it's been great, Eric. Thank you so much.
You bet. And our last thank you is for you, the listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Dream Architect Life podcast with Brian Sweet and Brittany Anderson. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Brian and Brittany come out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. And we humbly ask you to share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review, as this will help others find the show. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at Sweet Financial Partners, this is Eric Johnson reminding you that possibility comes to those who create it. And we'll see you next time.